Hello, so I want to talk about a contentious issue. It's one that I've never actually raised before, um, and I think it's quite an important one, at least in cyberspace. I want to talk about the issue of respecting countries' sacrifices. I've just been watching the film Flags of Our Fathers, the Clint Eastwood film about the Battle of Iwo Jima during World War II. I was going to actually make a review of that film, but instead of doing that, I'll stick to this subject. Might make a review of it later on, depending on my time frame. What I actually want to talk about, because I've come across this online, I was watching various videos about World War II and so on. One thing that unfortunately is apparent in cyberspace is that there is a disrespect between countries, nationals of those countries, of which country sacrificed more, historically, but especially regarding World War II. Um, Now, I have to say, before I continue, a number of my subscribers are American, and to those guys or girls, I would say, please hear out what I have to say. You've watched my videos for a while, so I think you'd have some idea about what I'm about and what sort of man I am. And for my part, from what I've seen, you guys are pretty open minded. So I would ask you to hear me out to not jump to conclusions about what I think. Um, but I do want to robustly condemn those who basically get into the gutter when it comes to talking about other countries. It does piss me off a bit because aside from being disrespectful, more importantly, it's factually wrong. Um, and it works both ways. You see these pointless nationalist arguments online. Now, the interesting thing about this is if it's arguments between, say, a Chinese user and a Japanese user, that's not really surprising because there's a long history of animosity between those countries. And that's not good. It's not a nice thing, but it's not surprising. Likewise, you get it with Greeks and Macedonians. You get it with, well, there's many examples. I guess Russians and Ukrainians would be another prominent example. But you also get it between Americans and Europeans. And I find this rather unfortunate because geopolitically, the United States and Europe are naturally allies. This goes without saying. In World War II, we were allies. Now, the purpose of me talking about this is not to shit stir, it's not to offend anyone else, but rather to point out a few basic facts and to point out how stupid and childish these sort of arguments are. The sort of arguments or the sort of points I'm talking about, comments I'm talking about, is really ultra nationalistic comments from certain American users and then responses from British or other European users about, and it basically goes along these lines. Oh, America saved your asses in World War II. America done this, America done that. America done everything in every war America's been involved in. This is obviously incredibly arrogant. It's very nationalistic, and I've no time for it. Um, I have a lot of respect for the United States of America. It's a country I have a great fondness for, and I have even defended the US at times when I believe that people have unfairly categorized it. However, I'm British, and I will defend my country's reputation when idiots are slandering it. So let's start with this allegation that we saved your asses in World War II. I'm sorry, but it's a lot of rubbish. What actually happened was throughout most of 1940, Britain stood alone. On the Western Front, Britain stood alone. We were being bombed day in and day out in the Blitz. Thousands of civilians were being killed. This was total war. We were being hammered in a way the mainland United States never saw. Imagine Pearl Harbor times 50. That's what Britain was experiencing. And in other parts of Europe, it was even more intense. So for most of 1940, the fact of the matter is we stood alone. President Roosevelt was trying to push for action through Congress, but the American Congress at the time was very reluctant to enter into war full scale because they still saw it as a European war. It's only with the attack on Pearl Harbor that the American thinking really changed. Now, those are the facts. Those are historic facts. Now, with the American entry into the war, was it a major event? Was it important? Of course it was. And I would never, ever, as someone who's very interested in history, deny that America was absolutely critical to the Allied success of World War II. There's no question about that. But what Americans need to understand and accept is that World War II would never have been won without British and Soviet participation. Now, because of the subsequent events of the Cold War, I feel that in the US, particularly, Soviet sacrifice has been massively underrated. 20 million Soviets died in World War II. 20 million. Now, say what you want about communism. I hate communism, but that is a fact. The Soviet Union had casualties that were on a scale unimaginable to the US or to Britain for that matter. So, when certain Americans online who have probably never even been in the military themselves say things like, "We saved your asses in World War II," it is an insult not only to the British civilians who died throughout 1940 and 1941, but to the thousands of soldiers who died at Dunkirk and other major engagements on the Western Front and in North Africa. Now, I'm not presenting myself as an expert academic on the history of World War II, but I have a basic knowledge of it, and those are the facts. Um, I never ever would dream of disrespecting those young American soldiers who died in the Pacific or any of the other theaters of World War II. So it disgusts me when I see Americans disrespecting my country. You know, the fact is, Britain and America, yes, there's been differences, but we have been very strong allies over the years. Look at recent years. Needless to say, Iraq and Afghanistan. Do these idiots online really think that when British soldiers and American soldiers are fighting in the sands of Helmand, they're thinking about which side done better in World War II? It's ridiculous. It's a stupid argument because both sides sacrificed greatly and both sides were absolutely essential to the winning of World War II. But I do not accept America alone won World War II. It's just nonsense. America played a massive role. I'm not downplaying that for a second. But the fact of the matter is, throughout 1940, Britain stood alone on the Western Front. With the exception of, I'm talking as a nation state, there was brave resistance movements from France and the Netherlands and so on. And I'm not downplaying their role, by the way. But as a nation state, as a great power, we stood alone. It's a fact. Um, I should say the British Empire stood alone because um, colonies, as they were at the time, like India, had very, very many brave soldiers who also sacrificed for this country. Something we should never forget, incidentally. So it just pisses me off when I see these sort of comments online. And to be fair, it does work both ways because then you get Britons coming out with insults about the American role. It's infantile and it's disrespectful, and there's just no need for it because more importantly than being disrespectful, it is just downright inaccurate. And a few things, by the way, about the British Army. On the first day, thinking of World War One, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, one of the major battles of the Western Front, this was, by the way, before American participation, 1916, 19,000 British servicemen were killed, and a very large number of those were from my home city, Belfast, Northern Ireland, the 36th Ulster Division. So when I see certain Americans online disrespecting British sacrifice, it really, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but when I see it, it does piss me off. And, I know this isn't the most important of things because internet losers are internet losers, but I do think that they need to be challenged, and I do think these points need to be raised because unfortunately you see it quite a lot in cyberspace. So my message with this video is it's not a case of which country is the bravest or which country. Oh, another point while I'm on this, I will raise this point. There's very often smears against France as well. Now, as a Briton, you could say I'm between both the US and France. I also respect France a lot as a country, and when I see comments like French surrender monkeys and French cards, that pisses me off. Because again, in World War One, France's sacrifices were massive. Massive. Those soldiers weren't cards, not even close to it. World War Two, talking about French surrender monkeys is an insult to the thousands of French resistance fighters. Now, you could say what you want about the Vichy government, that's a different matter. Say what you will about the French government's actions during World War Two, but French citizens, thousands of them, volunteered in the French resistance. Many took massive risks. So, again, these sort of comments are based on sheer ignorance. French surrender monkeys, that sort of smear came about at the time of the Iraq War when there was a lot of nationalist feelings because France was vociferously opposing the invasion. But I just think it's unfortunate that this sort of nationalist thinking pollutes people's minds and gets them into a state where they just have to get into the gutter and insult other countries' sacrifices. I would never, ever, ever do that against any country, in fact. I would never, ever come out with a crude, infantile comment about Germans or Japanese who were killed during World War Two. Why? I wasn't in there. What right do I, as someone who's never served in the armed forces, what right would I have to insult anyone who experienced war directly? I don't have that right. As an educated person, I can talk about what happened in World War Two, but I have no right to insult any of the people who were involved in it. And it just pisses me off that people have this sort of nationalistic thinking. Likewise, I hate communism as a political ideology, as a totalitarian system, but I would never ever dream of insulting Soviet or Chinese troops who died during the war, because those two countries had sacrifice on a scale absolutely unimaginable to the other Allied states, like the UK and the US and Canada and Australia. The sacrifices that China and Russia saw during the war were absolutely off the scale. And I would be tempted to say if those sort of casualties were seen either in the United Kingdom or the United States, we would have a complete breakdown. So, you could argue that it was because communist systems didn't value human life. And, there's a saying that every Soviet man, woman, and child was a soldier and so on. But nevertheless, that was a sacrifice on a massive scale. A lot of these sort of debates were reopened last year with the massive parades in Moscow and Beijing to mark the 70th anniversary of the end of the war. One of the criticisms was that Western leaders didn't attend. My own view on that is that in the case of China, especially, Xi Jinping was using it for a nationalist agenda, but the event itself was poignant because China did sacrifice enormously. That's a fact. Although I would point out that a lot of the Kuomintang troops who were actually fighting the Japanese, they were sacrificing, and it's the communists that took all the credit for that. Because the communist state was declared in 1949. So I would say that if Xi Jinping and the Communist Party is talking about Chinese sacrifice, they should never overlook the sacrifice that the nationalist Chinese played, which was massive. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. The purpose of this video is just to, frankly, educate. And I'm not, trying to pick a fight with my American viewers. I'm sure you guys would be open-minded enough to agree with some of the things I'm saying. Rather, I'm talking about the ignorant people online on both sides who want to insult another country's sacrifice. I think it's reprehensible. Now, I understand in a time of war when two countries are directly at war with each other, you're going to get those nationalistic sentiments. But for goodness sake, we're talking about Britain and America, allies as countries. in World War II and every subsequent war since, except those that we were not involved in. But the point is, in my city there is a memorial 10 minutes from where I live, and on that there's a plaque, 15 stone plaques, 15, and they're showing every military engagement that this country has been involved in since World War II. In my city alone, dozens of young soldiers have been killed. So, I'm not a military man. I haven't served in the armed forces, but I respect those who have. And as a British national, of course, I feel offended when I see people insulting my country in that sort of way. Just as an American citizen would feel offended when people insult American sacrifice. It's a basic principle of respect. So I hope people watching this will take some things away and maybe agree with some of the things that I am saying. And maybe I'll just show you something which may or may not be poignant for this particular video. You can see there I have four flags. I'll show you again. France, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Now my point with this is not to say that I love these countries more than any other countries in the world. It's not sort of like, I'm not a neo-nationalist, but they represent four of the five UN Security Council members, and I'll probably get a Russian flag as well, even though I abhor current Russian policy, because nation states go above any particular government. That's what people need to understand. And the sacrifice of soldiers, again, goes above the politics of any particular government. I mean, one thing I like about, I wasn't going to make a review, but I will say this. One thing I respect about Clint Eastwood is he's a very intelligent film director, because when he made Flags of Our Fathers, he also made Letters from Iwo Jima to show the Japanese side. And he humanized the Japanese in that film. He wasn't mitigating Japanese war crimes, but what he done was humanize individual soldiers. Now, in the world today, in China, and I promise I'm not going to make this too long, but in China, the Japanese are still very much vilified. I've been in Chinese marketplaces where there's depictions on T-shirts showing the Japanese as devils. So in East Asia in particular, there is still a very deep neo-nationalism there, and there's obviously all these disputes about the islands and so on, which I'm not going to get into in this video. But the point I'm making with that is that if old enemies like America and Japan can find a way to humanize each other, then maybe there is hope that one day there will be understanding between China and Japan. I hope there will be in my lifetime, for the sake of everyone. And it's not a case of rewriting history or mitigating anything, but it's a case that that cannot be the mentality forever. And as a European, I will say one final thing. I am very proud of the fact that my country and Germany, whilst we have disagreements, have very good relations today. I think that's a wonderful thing, and I'm proud of it as a European. I am British, first and foremost, but as a European, I am proud of that fact. Not long ago, I was in a pub talking to two gentlemen from Dusseldorf. A month later, I visited their city. And I don't mean to be overly sentimental with this, but the point I'm making is people need to see individuals as individuals and not judge people solely by their nationality. And I'll round this up here. Thank you very much for watching.